Welcome to Sleep Philosophy. This is a space where timeless ideas and profound reflections meet gentle storytelling. Through calming narratives, we explore philosophy and the human experience, offering you a chance to reflect, relax, and ease into restful sleep. Tonight, we'll explore a story inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche's idea of the death of God. This profound concept reflects the decline of traditional values and beliefs and the challenge of finding new meaning in their absence. Our story takes us to a small chapel where a young caretaker named Miriam faces an empty congregation and questions the purpose of her work. Through Miriam's journey and the legacy of Samuel, the chapel's first caretaker, we'll reflect on the nature of faith, meaning, and the human need for purpose. Settle in, relax, and let's begin. The chapel stood at the edge of the village, its spire rising into a pale morning sky streaked with soft pinks and grays. Mist lingered on the cobblestone streets, curling around the stone walls like a delicate veil. Miriam approached the heavy oak doors, her footsteps slow and deliberate, the iron key cold against her fingers. For a moment, she paused at the threshold, her eyes tracing the intricate carvings on the wood, patterns of vines and leaves etched by craftsmen long gone. With the twist of the key, the lock click opened, and the door creaked as she pushed it inward. The familiar sound reverberated through the stillness, filling the space for just a moment before fading. Inside, the air was cool and tinged with the faint scent of beeswax and aged wood. Dust motes hung suspended in the shafts of light, streaming through the stained glass, painting the stone floor in fractured hues of red, blue, and gold. Miriam stepped inside, her footsteps soft but purposeful. The silence greeted her like an old companion, familiar, yet weighted with something unspoken. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of reverence that she remembered from her childhood. It was somehow heavier now, thick with the absence of voices and song. She walked to the altar where a single candle stood unlit. Striking a match, she held it to the wick and watched the flame sputter before catching. Its light wavered at first, then steadied, casting delicate shadows onto the walls around her. For a moment, Miriam stood still, her gaze fixed on the flame. A question rose within her, unbidden but insistent. Why am I doing this? Who is this all for? Miriam's earliest memories of the chapel were steeped in light, sound, and warmth. As a child, she had sat in the third pew with her parents week after week, her legs swinging above the floor. The stained glass windows transformed the sunlight into vivid mosaics, their colors shifting and glowing as the day wore on. She remembered tracing the patterns with her eyes, imagining herself stepping into the stories they told. Sunday mornings were full of life. The villagers arrived in waves, their voices blending into a hum of greetings and laughter as they filled the pews. The choir's hymns soared to the vaulted ceiling, weaving a tapestry of sound that seemed to lift the entire space. Miriam's mother sang softly, her voice lilting and tender, while her father's deeper tones resonated beside her. Together, their harmony felt unshakable, like a foundation upon which everything else in her life was built. The chapel had been alive then, a place where the outside world seemed to pause, where time itself felt slower, more deliberate. But even in those vibrant days, Miriam had noticed the cracks beginning to form. Families moved away, their pews left empty and untouched week after week. The whispers of neighbors seeking new opportunities grew louder, and the life that had once filled the chapel began to ebb away. One afternoon, while cleaning the sacristy, Miriam discovered the journal. It was tucked behind an old chalice, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. She picked it up carefully, brushing off a fine layer of dust before opening it. The pages, yellowed and fragile, carried the faint scent of paper left too long in the dark. The handwriting inside was neat and deliberate, each word carefully inscribed. The journal belonged to Samuel, the chapel's first caretaker, who had tended to it for over 40 years. Miriam had heard the stories of Samuel as a child, how he had dedicated his life to the chapel. His unwavering faith inspired the entire community. But as she read his entries, she began to see a different picture. The pews were full today, one entry began, the hymns soaring as if they could pierce the heavens. And yet, as I stood at the back, I found myself wondering, do they sing for him, or do they sing for themselves? What is faith, truly? Is it devotion, or is it somehow a mirror that we simply hold up to see our own reflection? Miriam's breath caught as she read. How could Samuel, a man she had always imagined as steadfast and certain, have questioned his purpose, even in the chapel's most vibrant days? She turned the pages, searching for answers. Samuel's later entries revealed a man that was deeply introspective, wrestling with questions that he could not easily answer. He wrote of moments when the congregation's prayers felt hollow, when their words felt rehearsed and even mechanical. He described watching faces during services, some serene, others distracted, and wondering whether the rituals of faith were acts of devotion or simply habits that were performed without thought. I wonder, he wrote, whether this place is a house of God or a house of habit. The prayers are spoken, the hymns are sung, but do they rise beyond these walls, or do they echo back to us, comforting us with the sound of our own voices? Even as the congregation flourished, Samuel found solace not in the services, but in the quiet, tangible tasks of care, polishing the altar, tending the garden, lighting the candles. These acts, though small, gave him a sense of purpose, even when his faith was wavering. Miriam lingered on these passages, feeling a strange kinship with Samuel. His doubts somehow mirrored her own, even though their circumstances were so very different. But if Samuel had questioned his purpose, even when the chapel was full, what did that mean for her now, when it was nearly empty? As Miriam read further into Samuel's journal, she came across an entry that felt different, heavier, yet more resolute. It was written years after the chapel's peak, during the early days of its decline. The pews were not as full today, he wrote. I watched as the voices faltered, as heads turned toward the empty spaces where neighbors once had sat. The energy that once filled this place, I feel it fading. I feel it in the silence that lingers after each hymn. Samuel went on to describe a moment of profound doubt. One evening, after everyone had left, he stood in the empty chapel, the flickering light of the candles casting long shadows. He wrote, I knelt before the altar, not in prayer, but in questioning. I asked not for answers, but for clarity. What is this work for, when faith itself feels so fragile? What is a house of worship, when no one comes to worship? But then, in the same entry, his tone somehow shifted. He described how, as he knelt there, the faint sounds of wind stirred the silence. Rustling through the stained glass, the light from the candles danced on the walls, and for a moment, he felt something, perhaps not divine, but deeply human. He wrote, perhaps the chapel is not for God alone. Perhaps it is for us, for those who seek solace in its quiet, for those who wish to find comfort in its stillness. Perhaps it is not the congregation that defines this space, but the simple act of keeping it alive. Miriam paused, her fingers resting on the page. Samuel's words stayed with her long after she closed the journal. The next morning, as Miriam unlocked the chapel doors, Samuel's reflections echoed in her mind. She stepped inside, the cool air brushing against her skin, and paused to look around. The emptiness was still the same, but it felt less oppressive now. It was as though the silence itself had softened a little. As she lit the altar candle, she thought about what Samuel had written, that the act of care itself could hold meaning, even in the absence of faith. She looked at the flickering flame and allowed herself to wonder, what if the chapel's purpose wasn't to serve a congregation, but to simply exist as a place of quiet reflection? That afternoon, she placed a new sign outside the chapel. It was simple, written in her neat, careful handwriting. Come in, rest, reflect, all are welcome. The first person to notice this sign was a young woman walking her dog. She paused at the threshold, glancing at the open door as if unsure whether she was allowed to enter. Miriam stepped outside and offered her a gentle smile. You're welcome to come in, she said. The woman nodded, hesitated for a moment longer, and then stepped inside. She walked slowly down the aisle, her footsteps soft against the stone floor, and sat in a pew near the back. Miriam watched as she bowed her head. It didn't seem as if it were in prayer, but perhaps in quiet contemplation. Over the next few days, more people came. An elderly man stopped by one evening as Miriam was sweeping the floor. I used to come here every Sunday, he said, his voice tinged with both nostalgia and maybe a bit of sadness. It's been years since I've stepped inside. Miriam smiled and gestured toward the pews. You're always welcome, she said. The man nodded, his eyes glistening, and sat in the front pew. He didn't pray out loud, but his hands were folded in his lap, his posture reverent. Miriam watched him for a moment before returning to her work. The chapel was no longer a place of worship in the traditional sense, but it was becoming something else, something that could be equally meaningful. Over time, the chapel began to feel alive again, though not in the way Miriam maybe had known as a child. It wasn't filled with hymns or sermons, but with quiet moments of reflection. People came and went, some lighting candles, others sitting silently in the pews, and the air carried a different kind of energy now, one that felt softer, more intimate. One evening, as the sun set and the stained glass glowed with the fading light, Miriam sat in the front pew. She let herself feel the weight of the day, the footsteps that had passed through the nave, the flicker of the candle she had lit. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. As you drift off, let's pause here to reflect on what this transformation could mean. Nietzsche's Death of God reminds us that the loss of a traditional framework is not the end of meaning, but the beginning of something new. When the old certainties fall away, we are left with the profound responsibility to create our own values. The chapel, once a house of worship, became a house of reflection, a space for quiet, for solace, for simply being. Its meaning was not inherited from the past, but created anew, shaped by the people who entered its doors and the quiet acts of care that kept it alive. Like Miriam, we too can find purpose in the spaces left behind, crafting something deeply human and profoundly beautiful out of what remains. The story of Miriam and the empty chapel invites us to reflect on the nature of meaning in a changing world. As traditional beliefs fade, we are left with the responsibility and the freedom to create new values, to find purpose not in what was, but in what can be. Thank you for joining me on Sleep Philosophy. May this story bring you peace, purpose, and restful dreams. Good night.